Friday, the third day in the month of October 2025. Welcome to the Friday edition of On the Lunch Table. We're glad that you could join us just like any other day, even as we discuss matters that pertain to public interest. I'm your host. My name is Porsche Ngongo, coming to you live on various platforms: Topstar, GoTV, DSTV, Zoku, among many other platforms. On the show this afternoon, we look at the 2026 national budget post-analysis. Last week, we had the Minister of Finance and National Planning, Dr. Stumbeko Msokotwane, presenting a 253 billion kwacha worth of budget to be spent in the coming year. I'm joined in the studios by Dr. Joseph Piri from the Zambia Institute of Policy Analysis and Research, ZIPA, just to share ZIPA's perspectives on the 2026 national budget. Many stakeholders have added their views on that budget. ZIPA should not be an exception. Welcome to the lunch table, and of course, welcome to Prime TV.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Paul, and good afternoon to our viewers.
Awesome. For the avoidance of doubt, let's begin by understanding what ZIPA is for the people that might not understand, just hearing ZIPA for the first time. Let's begin from there.
All right, so ZIPA stands for Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research. It's a quasi-government research think tank that was established in 2006 and became fully operational in 2009. And its mandate is to stimulate policy through data-driven research that is just there to guide governments and other policymakers through research. And we have 6 thematic areas, which is macroeconomics, public finance, emerging theme, trade and investment, as well as human development. So basically, we research on areas that are key for national decisions. So every year, ZIPA, for the last 12 years, we've been doing the post-budget analysis, where we give our perspective on what we think of the budget, how we think it will be impactful in terms of the macroeconomic objectives of the country. And that's just basically what ZIPA does. So we normally work with other think tanks, government agencies, corporations, in order to work on issues that have got a common interest, in terms of issues that have got thematic lines of interest, as well as issues that are beneficial to the nation.
Awesome. That is important to know that think tanks still exist, because that's one of the things that many people have been indicating, that we need to have more of this, and glad to see the work that ZIPA is doing. Let's zero down to the 2026 national budget. Minister of Finance, National Planning proposed to spend 253 billion plus in the coming year, with adjustments in terms of budgetary allocation in various sectors. I will get to that, especially the key sectors. But let's begin by understanding, from your perspective, what stands out the most in the budget in terms of allocations and targets.
All right, so I think the first thing that we did notice in terms of the budget is, of course, there's been an increment in terms of the figures. But we also did notice that the budget was also increased in terms of, firstly, on the economic affairs. A bigger portion of which was moved towards debt servicing, because we did notice that, of course, the government will start meeting its obligation towards debt servicing, which will start in 2026. And then we also did notice that with the decline in ODA, which has now been withdrawn, about 25% of the budget has been allocated towards education and health. So there's an element of which has gone towards the social sector. And then also what we've noticed also in the budget is that there's also been a good portion of it to stimulate the growth of the middle-income businesses and small and medium enterprises, because there's a lot of tax exemptions and a lot of incentives in the manufacturing sector, in the agro-processing sectors, and also basically incentives that are to promote local production for goods that are produced locally. I think that's also one thing that we did notice. And of course, we also did notice that government is trying to engage a lot in quite a huge amount of capital investments. So I think that we did actually pick that actually there's quite a huge number of them. And of course, we did notice that they're trying to keep the real GDP at a higher figure, which is around 6.4%, and trying to lower down inflation in the single digits. But I think what we did notice ideally is that this is at the end of the 8th National Development Plan, and it's probably safe to say that the budget is to some extent pro-poor.
Pro-poor, I'll come to that when you say the budget is pro-poor. But you've indicated issues to do with the projected GDP growth, pegging it at 6.4%. And we know what happened in the previous year. We had to begin to downgrade based in terms of our projections. How realistic is this target, given also the prevailing economic conditions? But also, we do understand, Doc, that we had some projections during the course of the year, which were also reduced because of these prevailing economic conditions. How realistic is this 6.4% projected GDP growth?
Okay, so I'll probably just speak about how our GDP growth has been over the course of the Earth National Development Plan, so that I can give you a perspective. So, of course, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've had a GDP growth rate of about 4%, and then in the last quarter, it was hovering around 5 to 6%. But one thing that we should also note is that the economy faced a lot of shocks. I think first we had the COVID crisis, and then we had the energy crisis, we had the drought, and then we also had some external shocks that came from the Ukraine war, the Israel war, which also had a bearing in terms of how our performance should be done. So basically, the 4% was still a success in view of the insinuating circumstances.
It was still a success?
In view of the insinuating circumstances that we found ourselves in. In the absence of the drought, in the absence of the energy crisis, there's a possibility.
And to just comforting ourselves when you say it was still a success when that was not what was initially targeted. Isn't that self-comfort, Doc?
Well, the reason why I'm saying that is because under normal circumstances, it could have been worse, looking at what prevailed. And it's very true to say that the target was not met, but because of those underlying factors. So coming to that, depending on how the economy plays out, it could be possible to get closer to 6.4% if the economy transforms. So what we hope to see as ZIPA is there's been a lot of pronouncement in terms of capital projects, incentives. So we hope that if these incentives are played out right, they're mounted right, and investments grow to some extent, maybe that will influence aggregate supply and production, and maybe have a bearing in terms of the raw GDP output. So what I would say is that yes, we do acknowledge that it is to some extent quite ambitious based on the previous figures, but considering the fact that the economy, we had a bumper harvest last year, we're expecting a bumper harvest this year. We're also seeing a lot of solar plants being commissioned, so we shouldn't expect business to be impacted in terms of the issues of load shedding. So what we expect as ZIPA is to see business to have full access to power in order for them to contribute to production based on what we've seen in the news as the year has come to a conclusion. So if those circumstances come to play, we have power, we have a bumper harvest, and then we have incentives that have been put in place, we should move towards a higher real GDP growth. Whether those will happen or not, I cannot tell right now, but based on what has been put in place, it gives room for optimism.
Here's my question, because all these projections are being put with the mind of the prevailing economic conditions. But now, for a layman, this is like, your son trying to indicate, I'll pass grade 7 if the teacher is nice to me. That's how it looks like. It's a gamble. You're putting conditions. I can only perform in this way if these parameters are met. Or if you pack fries and chicken for me, then that is when I will be able to get 70% and above. That's how it's sounding like.
So there are two dynamics here when it comes to economic performance. Even the GDP growth that you're going to see, for example, the budget in itself is about 20% of the raw GDP. What does that entail? The other 80% has to come from the private sector. So the government only has a role to enable the environment for entrepreneurship to flourish. So if the government has ensured that businesses have got tax incentives, the government has provided electricity, and the government has ensured that people get access to liquidity, the rest is left to the private players to ensure that they are innovative enough. So if everybody plays in their part, then we expect real GDP growth. So if the government does its part and the private sector does not respond, then we will not have that 6.4%. But if all players play their equal part and they contribute substantially to that, we will get closer to that.
So as things stand, if the status remains as it is, this is unrealistic. If the prevailing conditions remain as they are in 2025, they continue in 2026, load shedding continues, the challenges affecting the private sector continues, it means this 6.4 is too ambitious. We are not realistic. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. If we don't have access to electricity, we don't ensure that the incentives are put into place, we don't ensure that the PPPs are put into effect, then it's safe to say that we should be concerned about the pronouncements made.
But also, Doc, isn't that worrying when we have these, pronouncements that come, because others would say you are appeasing the people, you want to excite the people that the economy will grow by 6.4%. Meanwhile, you know that it is almost impossible to deal with the other prevailing challenges that are there. doesn't that sound like you're just appeasing the Zambians when we know that in real terms this is unattainable?
Well, I think that's a very good question, but one thing you have to understand is that right now when the budget was submitted, right now we are having submissions in Parliament, and we have Parliament to debate and ensure that they come into effect. So the government can only do as much as we hold it into account. So if the private sector can do their part, Parliament can do its part, government will probably not be able to get away with pronouncements. So I think at the end of the day, checks and balances have to be put in place to ensure that all the pronouncements are put into effect. Because remember that the budget has to be approved by Parliament, and should there be a supplementary budget, it has to be approved by Parliament. So should the government deviate from its promises, or should all the allocations promised to education and health not come to fruition, then someone has to raise the question, because we expect some liquidity to come in through the DRIM taxes that you and I pay. So I think all we have to do is let's trust the system. I think so far we've seen that in terms of governance, there's been a bit of progress over the last 3 years as compared to how it could have been maybe 10, 15 years ago. So I think we are moving in the right direction, but we just need to put our heads together and all contribute to the economic transformation agenda. What I would say on the 6.4 GDP growth is, I think government need to be also targeted in its approach. I'll give you an example of what I said in the previous presentations I've had is, even in terms of agriculture, for example, which is a pillar under the 8th National Development Plan, we need to ask ourselves to say, should we just end up giving seed and fertilizer and then they plant and then we sell the seeds or buy the seeds? Probably not. So what the government then has to do is they have to make sure that people have got the resources, people have got the skills and the right training to ensure that they are more productive, to ensure that out of the maize they could perhaps even produce some feed, out of the animals that they produce, they could produce some cheese, they could process their product, and then that will have a much bigger bearing on the raw GDP output. So what we are saying is the CDF in itself alone is not enough. The plans alone are not enough. We need to ensure that people have got the right skills to ensure that they contribute substantially towards the 6.4 GDP growth that is projected. So in my own opinion, I believe that we are already moving towards the right direction in terms of the resources that are expected, but now we just need to make sure that they are well targeted and are used to the intended people who are able to use it to realize the most optimal production out of it.
Earlier on, you said you mentioned something very clear, which I was headed to. You know, talking about our domestic revenue, our DRM. The budget indicates that domestic revenue is expected to rise to 22.3% of the GDP. Do you think the current tax and revenue mobilization strategies are sufficient to achieve that? And also, the progress we've been making also to just ensure that our domestic resource mobilization strategies are working. Many stakeholders, and you are aware, Doc, have been indicating that we have the capacity to generate enough resources, from within our borders.
Yes.
Let's get to that. Domestic revenue expect rise to 22.3%. Do we have the right strategies? Are we on the right path to generate this income?
Yeah, so looking at the last budget cycle, ZRA recorded over 20%, I think, the last projection they gave, which is already progress in the right direction. So if we're going to look at it as a trend, we should expect some progress in that regard. However, what I will need to say is there have been concerns that have been raised by ZRA that actually much of the people that are not compliant are the smaller businesses, you and I, much more than the bigger corporations. So I think we just need to ensure that, one, we all comply, we all cooperate. Two, ZRA has to ensure that the incentives and the rules are quite harder on people that are not compliant. And so far they've been doing quite well. Like, for example, people who are not compliant, they always retrieve their tax compliance certificates. I think that has also helped, because more often than not, people have noticed they're not able to transact because of that. And I think also ZRA now has also ensured that even as we make local transactions or even receive money, say from apps like World Remit, PaySend, all those aspects will be captured through an online system. What I would recommend, of course, so far is with Smart Invoice, they've done so well with the businesses. They've been able to capture those transactions. But I think that technology needs to roll over to even mobile money, because they'll be able to track down and trace the transaction and be able to see how much has been captured, how much hasn't been captured. Of course, yes, they've been pronouncing that, maybe mobile money would be taxed here and there. So in my opinion, they have the technology. If they work hand in hand with Smart Zambia, they work hand in hand with ICT's experts. But what I would say is, maybe depending on how fast they implement this, whether they'll start in January, whether they'll start in March, will have an ultimate impact on whether we'll realize the 22.3% out of DRIM. But based on what we've seen in the past year, where it wasn't as efficient as expected, there's been some progress. So we can use that as a benchmark to ascertain that 1 or 2% extra is realistic or perhaps possible.
Great. Well, a major concern has come, and this is a statement as economists you heard, that you cannot tax your people to prosperity. This budget seems to fall heavily on taxing the Zambians. 81% of the budget will be funded by ourselves, and the major source is taxes. Isn't that a burden to the Zambian people? Isn't that unfair to the ordinary Zambian when they are already struggling with high taxes, and yet the budget focuses on that yet again?
I think we have to be careful when we're looking at the aspect of DRM. I might be corrected, correct me if I'm wrong. I think when the government argues that 80% of the budget will be forecast by DRM, it doesn't entail that 80% of the budget will be forecast by targeting local businesses or Zambian-owned businesses. So if I have a company from South Africa, a butchery, and then I set it up in Zambia, the money that I will pay as tax will still come in as a bracket that is captured under DRM, because that business is owned in Zambia and registered in Zambia. So I think we just need to be careful with regards to that. However, speaking about whether the budget has been set to help the poor or not, I think there is some positive out of it. For example, if you look at the thresholds about taxes, I think they've increased from 1,000 to 2,000 in terms of the threshold of which people pay turnover tax and all those aspects. So I think it's a budget that is holistic. And from what I see and what we see as ZIPA in terms of why is it that maybe much of the incentives, much of the benefits are targeted towards the smaller businesses, I think over the past 5 years, I think we've seen that I think corporations have also done their share, and I think the idea is that now let's give incentives to the local businesses so that they can also contribute by growing their business, and then they spill over.
Someone will argue, to cut you short, someone will argue, Doc, when you say that 81% is not majorly taxes, maybe you can expound, because if you look at the domestic resource, 81.6%, majorly is income tax. Value-added tax, customs and exercise duties, export duties, and of course the last component is non-tax revenue. But the majority, we're still about taxes.
Yeah, so you are right on that one, Paul. But remember, the idea is that Zambia is quite an open economy, so you'll find that this type of tax, income tax, value-added tax, they are targeted for all forms of income that falls within those brackets, regardless of the nationality of the person or the business domiciled in Zambia. So what ZRA should have done is perhaps give us a benchmark to say, from these businesses that we expect DRM, which ones are locally owned, which ones are foreign owned. However, we risk a situation where we might seem like we're just targeting a specific line of business. So I think this was just a blanket tax. So if there's a lot of businesses that are owned in Zambia and they're making revenue through that, they'll still be taxed. So I understand your point, say the majority of businesses are owned by Zambia, but that's something that we really need to explore, to say those who are paying income tax, value-added tax, customs tax, how many or what proportions of that are owned by those with Zambian IDs. I think that's something that we needed to explore further.
Because also others have indicated, look, whether that is factual, maybe you may want to clarify for the benefit of the viewers out there, that a number of these foreign entities, if you get, for example, in the mining sector, you'll find that a number of them even enjoy these tax holidays in court. You might want to clarify that for the benefit of the viewers. And yet, Zambian firms, the marketeer, in city market, we see Lusaka City Council going to collect levies. We see ZRA pouncing on them. One of the things we said earlier is that is the area that ZRA wants to focus on, small scale, businesses.
All right, so I think it's a very good question, but I think one thing you look at, if you look at the history of taxes, over the past couple of years, a lot of outside businesses have had a lot of tax exemption and all, but I think that now in this year's budget has been unique because the shift towards tax exemption has moved towards the local businesses. So what we've seen in this year's budget is they're trying to see how those benefits can trickle down to the business, because if you remember, even in the SONA, there was that aspect to say, should we move towards agro-processing? Should we move towards manufacturing so that we can encourage local production? For example, items that are produced at the MFAs, they've put extra duty on the items that are imported from outside to encourage local production. So I think one thing that you have to understand is that budgets have got phases. So in the previous phases, at the beginning of the 8th National Development Plan and perhaps in the phases of 7th National Development Plan, we had a lot of inflows of outside businesses which have now domiciled and stayed in Zambia. But now those businesses have reached a point of saturation, and that is why in this year's budget, the focus might have shifted towards how can we encourage local businesses to grow and be competitive in nature, and that is why they're having these exemptions. However,
so it's true they're having these exemptions.
The local businesses, yes, they are.
What of foreign business?
Foreign businesses, so far in this year's budget, last I checked, there hasn't been any exemption that they've been given further, and of course there is also a debate about revising some of them. So some of the exemptions that we see, like for example in terms of the businesses that have been pronounced in the budget, most of them are just for local businesses. Of course, there is what we call a spillover effect, so where if a business existed 3 years ago and was given a 5-year window period of exemptions, you don't expect it to be cut in the 3rd year. So those businesses and the benefits will still continue even up until they reach a point of conclusion.
Foreign entities that are enjoying these tax exemptions, these tax holidays, especially in the mining sector.
So what happens in terms of the exemptions? There are those exemptions that are under the ZRA, and there are those that are under ZDA. So normally ZDA's mandate is just there to encourage investments from outside to stimulate and contribute to growth. So there are some exemptions that ZDA did put across that will encourage inflow and growth of businesses within Zambia. But if you look at the exemptions that have been put across in this year's budget, the focus has been on small-scale mining, the focus has been on artisanal mining, which are locally owned mines. So at the end of the day, we are reaching a point of equilibrium where the government wants to ensure that the benefits which were never felt by the local businesses spill over to the businesses. But one thing that I want to say is I think it's quite a debatable issue, this budget. I'll be dishonest if I say that the budget is 100% to the benefit of the locals or 100% to the benefit of the foreign entities. I think there is always a pros and cons. There will always be winners and losers. So I think at the end of the day, let's try to see how we can explore and take advantage of this. So holistically, the budget has ensured that the supply side is enhanced. We're expecting 100% production of electricity as Zipper, because that's what we've been told in the budget. We've seen solar plants commissioned. So we are hoping that that will help the local business have access to power in order to contribute to growth. And we are hoping that these exemptions that have been put across will come into fruition. And we are also hoping that the local business will be encouraged on how they can legalize and register their businesses so that they can get the full benefit out of these exemptions. Yeah.
Great. Let's get to other components. The fiscal deficit is projected to drop to 2.1% of the GDP. What does this mean for Zambia's debt sustainability and overall fiscal health?
All right. So I think it's what we expect is it's also linked to what's currently has been happening to the debt GDP ratio in terms of our fiscal health. If you look at our debt to GDP ratio in 2020, it was at 105% according to IMF projections. As at now, it's hovering around 91, 92%. So what this entails is that we're expecting firstly, the government to generate more revenue from a productive economy. So as the fiscal deficit is reducing, there are two aspects that could possibly happen. One is either our debt stress levels are declining by us paying, or two, our economy is being more productive by having more capacity to pay back the debt. So what this entails and what we expect out of it is we expect that we're going to be reducing on our debt stress levels by having been able to pay back our obligations which are coming in next year's budget. But secondly, we're going to have a productive economy which is going to have capacity to pay and outstand the shocks that are likely to prevail in the subsequent years and beyond. So basically what this entails is that the macros are enabled, the economy is growing substantially, and over time we'll probably be able to pay the debts perhaps even earlier than projected, because we as Zipper have been doing studies on this, and we're planning to launch one on the 23rd of October on the Beyond the Sovereign Debt Default. What we did find is if we're going to continue with the projections and the diversification agenda, and if we're going to realize the GDP growth which is being projected, you realize that Zambia will be able to even pay back or have capacity to pay back its debt much earlier than anticipated. Because remember, at the time of the default, we were quite vulnerable. We went to IMF and we showed the weakest part of our vulnerability. But looking at how things have evolved now, we expect to have more potential to compete, to have a higher real GDP growth, and hopefully pay our debt much earlier than anticipated, because that is very much key so that we do not affect the future generation, you and I's grandchildren.
Great. Let's also touch on some of the sectors, in terms of budgetary allocation, and I wanted to pick the thoughts on the social protection sector. If you do a comparison between 2026 budget, 2025, 2024, even getting back as, far back as 2023, you'll see that there has been a reduction in terms of budgetary allocation. Last year's budget, 2025 budget to social protection was standing at 16 billion. This 2026 has gone down to 15. Quite shocking, of course. We know that some of the components that we're talking about here has to do with social cash transfer. We know how the vital role it has continued to play in ensuring that the poverty levels are also addressed. Public service pension payments, cash for work, security packs. But there's been a reduction. Shouldn't this worry us? Why do you think, first of all, we have a reduction in this sector?
All right, so what has happened is the needs that are prevalent in the social sector, I think, have still been the same and could still be higher, especially now with the withdrawal of ODA. But what has happened is now we have a lot of revenue pools which could address the same amount of needs. So you find that ideally the expectation in terms of the social protection sector is that we expect spending towards education, towards health, towards sanitation and all those amenities. And that should be blocked into one budget which should look at them holistically. But now what has happened now with the emergence and the introduction of CDF, you find that some of those needs are still addressed within the funds that are located in CDF. So it still comes back to a situation where we still have double payment, where part of the benefits that we expect to come out of the expenditure spend on that budget line should still come out from the CDF allocation, and they will still be used for a similar intended purpose. So I think what we recommend as ZIPA in that space is where that gap has been closed in terms of that decline, something else like in terms of the benefit that goes to those constituencies where those social needs are should be highly monitored, should always be followed through to ensure that the benefits do not decline regardless of what has just happened.
But when you talk about some of the components being catered for under CDF, some out there might argue with you, Doc, to say, look, analyze the various components that are under CDF. You will not find social cash transfer there. You will not find cash for work under CDF in the components. You will not see the food security packs there. You will not see public service pension payments there. So when you say that some of the components in CDF are covering for this, someone might argue with you.
Yeah, you're very much right, about the possibility of arguing. But if you look at the cash for work and its genesis, I think it came out as a result of the drought. So it came in as a mitigation measure, as a supply shock to respond to that need.
That's always been there, even way before the drought.
Yeah, but if you realize it was there to address those needs. But I think looking at how the dynamics have played out, because at the end of the day, the economy needs to respond to the macros that prevail. Last year we recorded a food balance sheet, surplus. I don't know if you're aware of that. So already there's been cushion which was still addressed in terms of reaching out the challenges. And in the subsequent year, we're also expecting a bumper harvest. Now, what I see and what we see as ZIPA in this year's budget is the challenges is the situation we found ourselves as an economy is quite worrisome, especially when it comes to debt obligations and all. So in one way or another, someone had to meet those debt obligations. So you find that some funds still need to be deviated to ensure that government starts meeting the obligation towards what we found ourselves in as a nation. So there had to be a balance, there had to be a trade-off. One person had to be affected in one way or another. Unfortunately, that is a sad reality.
Okay, so just joining us, we are analyzing the 2026 national budget that was presented by the Minister of Finance and National Planning, Dr. Stumbeko Msokotwane, in the National Assembly last week, Friday. And in the studios, I do have Dr. Joseph Piri from the Zambia Institute of Policy Analysis and Research, who is sharing ZIPA's perspective on the 2026 national budget. Of course, later on, of course, we should be able to get your calls, time allowing. But before we get to that, with climate shocks like, for example, the 2024 drought, which I think we've belabored to talk about, and its impact, we know how, the kind of impact, the memories are still fresh, Does the budget adequately address resilience in agriculture and energy? I was listening to one energy expert who was indicating that there's nothing much that the budget has talked about when it comes to the energy sector.
I think you have a point in that one, and I think we share a similar perspective as ZIPA. As much as it's an ambitious budget, has its own pros, I think in the areas of climate, we also feel that I think more resources would have been located to that space to ensure that the mitigation effects are more pronounced, especially that we live in a community where people are not quite aware of climate adaptability measures. So what we would recommend is, currently we're still making submissions to Parliament, and people are making submissions to Parliament. I think that's also one area that we feel that should perhaps be looked at, perhaps even as they finalize the final budget, especially the aspect of climate and the drought. Maybe on the issue of energy, we're at least hoping that maybe there'll be some positives that will come out of the solar aspect. But in terms of the resilience coming from the drought, especially in parts that were most vulnerable, I think perhaps more could be done in that regard.
Why do you think there hasn't been so much, attention to the energy sector in the budget when it is the biggest elephant in the room? Ask an ordinary Zambian right now. That's the greatest shock that they have. It is the shock coming from the energy crisis, and yet nothing substantial has come out from the budget.
Right. Yeah. So from the way we looked at it is, I think there are probably two issues that arose. I think there was, of course, the issue of the other obligations, but I think also what has happened is, of course, now government has, I think there is the climate on energy fund. I think they did try, I think, in terms of trying to address it, but I think what we just need to do is, to what extent can we ensure that... When you say
they tried, what is there to see that they tried? I think that's the biggest question. If you say they tried to address this crisis, what can we point to in the budget that shows the owners of the funds that they tried?
All right. So what happens is, normally some of the investments have got what we call a lag effect, where they could be instituted now, but you'll be able to see the benefit in the subsequent period. So I think this year we've seen a lot of energy plants that are being commissioned, but at the end of the day, they've been commissioned towards the end of the year, and what we are hoping is that next year they'll be fully operationalized, and that will help address the energy crisis. But like I said, because of the lag effect, that benefit can be felt now, and we're hoping that will spill over into the subsequent year. How it's going to spill over and how the mechanisms are going to be done is where we hope that there'll be prudence, and where we ensure that each and every person benefits from that lag effect. But in terms of those plans or those commissions being in the next year's budget, we've seen also a decline. So we're hoping that the benefit of what is being commissioned this year will spill over to the subsequent year. At least that's one thing that we did notice, because that's how normally it works in terms of capital investments. You only see the results at a much subsequent period. So we are hoping that maybe the plants that are being commissioned in Eastern Province, the northern part of the country, those benefits will be felt by you and I when we move into manufacturing, into production. So I think in this specific space, yes, Zambians are right in terms of the specific allocation to energy. It could be minimal, but at the same time, it will be too harsh to judge whether the benefits have been felt or not. So let's give it a benefit of doubt and see within the next quarter, next year, to see if there'll be any benefit that will come out of the energy plants being commissioned. Because what we expect is to see benefit at the end of the day.
Someone indicated that is one of the things that you expected to come out quite clearly, Doc, and I want to get your perspective clearly as Zipper, because that has been a huge concern from the members of the public. Some experts have also lamented that, look, this is something that we're expecting to see pronounced, but no.
Well, I think it has been pronounced. I think, the budget, the Green Book, the SONA and the budget, they normally move hand in hand. So if you remember when the Green Book was launched and when the SONA was being announced by the President, those pronouncements were already made. So pronouncing them at the budget's time can also amount to some level of duplication. But one thing that I know, I'm not an energy expert, so let me say a disclaimer. One thing that we should expect and hope for as ZIPA is we have to see the benefits of those pronouncements to culminate into the subsequent year. And that is why I was saying that 6.4 growth is only going to work if the supply side are enabled when you asked if it was realistic. So if those plants start working and all the business have access to power 24 hours a day, unlike the current 5-8 hours that we have, we should expect more production. But remember, the government will only enable the environment by providing electricity, by making sure that people have got access to incentives, but beyond that, the production that will come out of businesses is the innovation that has to come from you and I. Yeah.
Let's tackle the issue of the constituency development fund and all that. Many people have been so interested to see how this spins out. Others, a number of CSOs actually were indicating that they didn't expect, CDF allocation to be increased from 36 to 40 million now, because of the challenges that we have seen, especially as regards to implementation. One of the components you are aware, Doc, the loan component, has even been halted because of failure by the recipients to pay back. As ZIPA, what is your view when it comes to now the increment of CDF from 36 to 40 million?
I think if you remember, just a few days before the budget was announced, we had the presser with our ED. I think you were also invited. I think there are two things that have made the CDF limited in terms of its execution. One, I think, suffice to say, I'll say this, that it's a good idea, it's a noble idea, the intentions are good. But I think we needed to ensure that the mechanism on how it's going to be rolled out, how it's going to be specific and targeted to ensure that it reaches the specific beneficiaries, and how to ensure that it's monitored and tracked down to ensure progress and accountability were already put in place. So I think there was a bit of limitations when it was put in place, and this is limitations that are still in existence up to now. So I think the CDF needs a stronger M&D component that will ensure that had we had a stronger M&D component right now,
4 years down the line,
we wouldn't have
should we still be talking about a stronger M&E component when from 2021, when we had the budget for 2022, we had those called bottlenecks, people struggling to even access the money. 4 years down the line, we're still talking about
no. We're speaking from our perspective as ZIPA, so I wouldn't be able to answer whether we should have had this issue right now. But I think the truth of the matter is that a stronger M&D framework would not culminate into problems like people already now being in default, as has been the case, where people have been taken to court and all those things. So I think we can still achieve this. So I think we just need to make sure that as this CDF budget is looked at and as it's been revised between now and the end of the year.
You upload the increment as ZIPA.
The increment is good provided the M&D component is enhanced, because if there is no M&D, then you will still go back to the same problem that you alluded to. So the point that I wanted to raise is between now and the execution, let's try to find a mechanism to ensure that we track down its execution, mechanism to ensure that we follow through those that already got funds, because at the end of the day, we might have a situation where this becomes a problem. We've had issues around the world with insurance where people have got an insurance fund and then it all goes down into liquidation and all. So all these are issues that can be addressed. So for us, what we think as ZIPA is, yes, there are delays, yes, there are lags, but it's never too late to ensure that the M&D is enhanced. And that is what we are keeping on to emphasize, that this should be emphasized in CDF, this should still be emphasized in the budget, and this should be emphasized before the execution in 2026.
Development experts will tell you that when a component in the project is having challenges, before you increase its allocation, deal with the prevailing challenges. It is folly to go ahead and add more money. It's like giving a layman example. A housewife that is struggling to manage 5,000, 5,000, she spoils it. Then you still want to go ahead and give her 10,000 for domestic use. You are killing her. You are not mindful of the resources. Can't this, be contextualized to our issue as a country when we're having challenges with CDF, and yet we are increasing the allocation? And also, Doc, you are aware, very much aware that we were told recently by, government that the absorption rate is very poor. In fact, we were told that in Lusaka, the absorption rate is actually less than 10%. Out of the entire money released, they only absorb less than 10%. But yet we're still increasing, Doc.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think for us, how we look at it is where the money has already been released and allocated, and you've mentioned quite clear that the absorption rate is quite low, we shouldn't reach a situation where next year becomes a spending spree, where now people start saying, no, now it's open, you can just go and get. So we still argue that there's still a mechanism to ensure that the M&D checks are in place. So I think there are so many levels of government where we need to ensure that this is brought into effect. The NDCC does meet. On our end as ZIPA, we are also working on an M&D framework with ASSET, which we are willing to support government. So I think all stakeholders need to come on board. The question is CDF a good idea or not? It is a good idea, which we all acknowledge, but if the absorption rate is going low, then the first question we need to ask ourselves is, why is it low? Is it that people are not aware, or is it that people feel like the money is going to specific people and not the deserving people. So once we start asking those prompting questions, then we'll be on the right trajectory to ensure that the intended use of CDF reaches fullest fruition. So for us, or for me, for us, what we feel like is it was a noble idea, and we still need to research, because ZIPA is a research institution. We don't make conclusions without research. I think what we would want to do and what we would be willing to support as a research institution is perhaps to go on the ground and really find out what has really happened with CDF. Are there winners here and there? There are some researchers who've been doing, but I think we need more research at the national level in order to make a complete position, because the problem with CDF, there's always narration. Someone will go here and say, I've benefited. Someone here will say here, say, I've not benefited. So I think we as an institution are very much willing to support that aspect to ensure that we can give a common position on CDF holistically, whether it's reaching its intended target or not. Whether the benefit or whether the idea is good, I think it's a common thing. We know that the idea behind CDF was instituted in goodwill to say, let the people decide what should be used for their resources, let them have their resources, but has the M&A been in place? And the local councils having the right skills to ensure that it's used correctly? Have they been trained? So I think that's a thing that we need to explore further to see whether the benefit has really been felt. So I would say it's a good idea, but let's explore it even as we disperse. So if concerns are quite genuine that it's not reaching its intended effect, it would be unfair for government to disperse 70% of CDF at the beginning of 2026. We might need to prompt it. And that's why Parliament is going on this debate. So let's bring that information and come to a conclusion on what needs to be done. But CDF in itself as an idea is noble. CDF in itself, if used correctly, increasing itself will not be a problem. All we just need to ensure is what is needed to ensure that the person in Shankombo benefits. What is needed to ensure that the person in Roma is aware of CDF and benefits out of it, because there are a lot of people that want to do business, but they have no access to resources. So CDF in itself might be a good starting point, but are people aware of it? Is the media disseminating the information? So all those are issues that need to be explored.
One of the things that you've spoken to quite clearly are issues to do with probabilities. If this is in place, Doc, but also from your observation as ZIPA, the last 3 years, what has been your observation as a think tank when it comes to capacity building of the local authorities who handle these amounts? What has been your observation as ZIPA in terms of the current M&E systems that are in place? What has been your observation as ZIPA, in terms of the absorption rates of these CDF?
So on the current M&E framework, I think what we've observed links in with some studies that we've done. We did a country economic transformation outlook study that we launched in March. We're looking at the bottlenecks that undermine economic transformation, of which CDF could also be key. So I think what we did notice is that we don't have the strongest capacity to manage it, and we also have a limited M&E framework. So I think that is where we probably need to start from to see that the benefits of the CDF are enhanced, because without a strong M&D framework, there will always be these concerns, there will always be these complaints. So I think what we believe at ZIPA is we need to support this M&D framework to ensure that people are capacitated not only by having the right resources to monitor, but also having the right technical know-how to ensure that what they do is right.
My question, Doc, and I wanted to come quite clearly, is from your observation and from various studies you've done, what is the status quo? Yes, we do understand we need stronger M&D systems. We do understand we need more capacity building, but what is the status quo from your various studies that we've done as ZIPA in terms of the M&D that is currently in place, in terms of absorption rates, in terms of capacity building? What is the current state? Because others have said, look, the local authorities don't even have the capacity to manage these funds. But I'd like to hear, and I know that you do a lot of travels and studies as a think tank. What has been your observation on the ground?
All right, so we actually did a scenario study with UCL when we were traveled to Choma, and one of the issues that was discussed is the CDF issue. So when people say that the local authorities don't have the capacities, there is some truth in that. So, and I think that is something that we do need to explore, because if the local authorities don't have the capacity to manage it, it's a holistic problem. That means they might not have the capacity to ensure that the people that are getting the CDF have got the right skills or are the most deserving, one. They might have limitations in order to ensure that they've got capacities to follow through and track down the progress. Two, they might also have limitations to ensure that they're given the right specific resources deserving a specific type of investment. When we went to Choma, we did find out that a good number of people that apply for CDF, they all want to be bus drivers or taxi drivers. So then the question that you need to ask yourself to say, is that the only form of investment that is in Choma? So all those are limitations that we did find out, and that is why we're saying that the aspect of CDF needs to be enhanced by, first, of course, ensuring that the capacity for the staff is enhanced, but also secondly, that we do a needs assessment to find out to say what really is needed by each constituency to ensure that they use the CDF appropriately. Thirdly, the other thing that we did notice is, of course, is on our own as ZIPA, we are not able to capture that information. We do have systems that are able to capture that information. That is why constituencies have councils, constituencies have MPs. So that information should have been captured by now, such that at the point that the budget was being presented, the increment to CDF was increased. That information was supposed to be known by each and every constituency to say, what are the major needs in my area? How can we ensure that we harness them to ensure that people have got access to businesses, they're out of poverty? So those bottlenecks and limitations are something that needs to be enhanced. And I think if those bottlenecks are addressed, the idea of additional CDF will reach its fruition perfectly. Of course, there are efforts in other areas is much more successful than others, but generally, I think these are the problems that really we did identify to say, yes, the issue of capacity is there. Maybe something that could have also come out is that when CDF came into force, I think that should have been 2021, was there a study that was done to find out to say, is this the best approach? Maybe that's also maybe where we needed to have found it, because you need to start an end line, you need a needs assessment, you need to go throughout the project, find out how far have we gone. So what we would recommend going into 2026, and I think there's still allocation for that, there's still room for that, there's still resources for that. Let's do a study at least in most of the constituencies around the country and find out these bottlenecks, how have they been addressed, what are the challenges. So that should government make a decision on another budget, at least they're able to find out that this is the position of the people in view of CDF. I think these bottlenecks have been identified. We've seen them as well. So I think addressing these bottlenecks was key. But like I said, CDF itself was not a bad idea, but just the bottlenecks are the limiting factors.
I was recently reading a report, produced by the Civil Society for Poverty Reduction, CSPR, on this aspect, and indicating that the disparity in terms of absorption and usage of CDF. Some constituencies have been doing quite well. Others, they're very poor when it comes to absorption. Constituencies like Rumezi, according to that report by CSPR, has been doing very well when it comes. In fact, according to that report, they've utilized over 120% of CDF. The question that remains is, why aren't other constituencies also?
Well, I'm not a politician, but I'll probably say this. I think when CDF was announced, I heard the minister say each constituency will know what to determine with its resources. CDF are run by councils, and to some extent they were also run by the parliamentary representatives. When people go to the ballot, these are the questions that they vote people into office, but once they vote people into office, they forget that they also have to do checks and balances. So if one constituency is doing better in terms of managing the CDF and another is doing pathetic, I think that's an issue that you have to ask, why is one constituency doing better than the other? So you might need to prompt the people that manage it, but at the same time you also have to check if the systems are in place, because sometimes you might blame the people that are managing it when in reality they've not been given the capacity to manage it. So it's a holistic problem that we really need to address. So why don't we find out from the constituency that is doing better, benchmark it and learn and see what mechanisms can be applied by others. You'll be able to notice that actually CDF is a good idea in that regard, and that's what we're saying. That should be explored further. But the issues of capacity really need to be addressed to ensure that the benefits are felt. As we close, 2 or so minutes before we close, what policy advice would you recommend as ZIPA, would you recommend to government to ensure that the 2026 national budget achieves its theme of consolidating the economic and social gains? All right, so I think what would recommend to government is that I think they've done a good first step. I think it's a very promising budget, but I think what needs to be done is this budget is on the threshold in the sense that success of this budget will depend on a strong M&D framework, strong checks and balancing, and ensuring that the benefits that have been pronounced trickle down to the masses. For example, if you're going to say that there will be incentives to SMEs, of which SMEs make 70% of the economy, any mistake or lapse on those incentives is as good as not realizing the 6.4 GDP growth that has been promised. So we really need to be specific, we really need to be targeted. There was mentioning about manufacturing, agro-process as ICTs as pillars that will help diversify from the tourism sector. Let's be strong in that space. And I think also what we'd recommend is we need the aspect of value addition in terms of productivity. I'll give you a simple example which is very much key for government. You find that if you have a 4 hectares piece of land and then you hire 10 people to work on that piece of land, at most you'll probably produce 200 bags. If you convert that to monetary bags, that is 10,000. If you're going to get an IT person that is smart as you to develop a website, that person will charge you 10,000. Now the question is, why does it take 10 people on a farm to produce the same amount as one person developing a website? Could we perhaps produce more than the bags? Maybe we produce our own feed, we produce our own butchery, and we ensure that people have got the skills and are more productive in that space. But also one thing that we did notice is maybe we need to also ensure that the budget also ensures that the aspect of climate is really addressed. I think we've seen in 2024 where the climate shock really affected us. So maybe also that's something that we should prepare ourselves. But I think generally the budget in itself is a good starting point. And we as ZIPA are there to support in terms of providing research, providing critical analysis that will guide decision making that are to the benefit of the economy. So I think it's a good budget to start with, but we really need prudence in terms of managing resources, supporting the growth of SMEs, and ensuring that the benefits trickle down to the masses.
Dr. Perry, thank you so much. I know we can go on. There's so many other components to look at in the budget, but time might not allow. Thank you so much for finding time as ZIPA to come through and share your perspectives on the 2026 national budget.
Okay, thank you.
That was Dr. Joseph Peary, an economist, consultant, researcher, educator, and analyst who is currently overseeing the macroeconomics at the research unit as a research fellow at the Zambia Institute of Policy Analysis and Research. That is ZIPA. He joined us as we looked at the 2026 national budget from ZIPA's perspective. On behalf of the entire production crew, my name is Poshingongo. Keep watching.